get back. First of all, can everybody hear me? Yep. If at any point you can't hear me or any of our panel, do just let us know. Don't suffer in silence. And the other thing I will do is just give you a little reminder after this morning's session that we are being live streamed, so don't say anything that you wouldn't want your bosses to hear or draw our attention to the fact you don't want to be streamed if that's the case. So I'm Miranda Stern. I'm chairing our second panel discussion of the Switch conference. Welcome. I'm head of learning at the Fitzwilliam Museum here in Cambridge. For those of you who don't know us, we're the principal museum of art and antiquities for the University of Cambridge. So although as head of learning, publics and their engagements is absolutely my thing, I'm feeling like a slight interloper because I'm not from an ethnographic museum or from a museum of world cultures, but I'm very pleased to be here nonetheless and to be chairing this panel. Some of you might know that since 2012, the 8 museum collections that are part of the University of Cambridge have worked together as the University of Cambridge Museums Consortium in the areas where we sort of feel we can be greater than the sum of our parts. And audiences and engagement is absolutely one of those areas. So I've had the privilege over the last 3 years since I joined to work closely with colleagues at MAA and sort of hear from the edges some of what's been going on within the Switch project and to sort of benefit in that way. So I'm really glad that sort of through MAA's involvement in this project, the wider kind of museum community here has been able to benefit from being part of that conversation by extension. And one of the things that strikes me is that some of the questions that you've been discussing, particularly questions around decolonisation, that maybe 5 years ago were thought to be primarily the preserve of ethnographic museums, increasingly we're recognising that these are questions that have pertinence for art collections, for natural history collections, etc. So I'm very happy to be here from that point of view. And that seems a good note to hand over to the first of our panellists, Shaz Hussain, who is in fact from the Science Museum. So, Shaz.
So I can guarantee pretty much nearly every woman in this room has been mansplained to at one point in her life. And all of us, men included, have probably had conversations where the other person thinks that they know better than us, and when they've spoken to us in a condescending tone, and it just kind of leaves a bit of a bad taste in your mouth. But today I want to talk to you about something that I just came up with, a word called museum-splaining. Museum-splaining, to comment on or explain something in a condescending, overconfident, and often inaccurate or oversimplified manner. A combination of overconfidence and cluelessness. Museums do this a lot of the time. I'm so sorry, British Museum, you probably just want to forget about this tweet. But here's an example of a very public situation in which that happened. I'm not going to dwell on it for too long because it is a bit of a sting to look at. The Tate's Maria Balshaw making comments about black men eating fried chicken in her gallery. Again, another really public outcry of people, rightly so, outraged about what she'd said. Or how about these headlines? They pop up quite a bit, and every time I turn on my computer or I look through the paper, when I see a headline about a museum, often it's quite negative. Museums do this kind of stuff in our sector all the time. But we're a pretty qualified sector. Collectively, we have many academic achievements under our belt. Our sector values knowledge. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't get down from our high horses sometimes. A lot of what I'm going to talk to you guys today about is stuff that happens online, on Twitter, on social media, on online news websites. And it's not because I'm a millennial and my entire life is on the internet, but because if you want to be a fly on the wall on the conversations that people are having, the public are having about our museums, about our collections, about the staff who work in museums, online is a really good place to start. You get conversations there from people who do visit our museums and plenty from people who don't visit our museums and adamantly do not. when we see headlines like this, is this the kind of engagement that we want to have with our public? As a museum professional, and especially as a curator, knowing that this is the way that the public perceives us is very much a sting. I hate seeing these negative headlines, but sometimes I have to admit I do agree with the people who make these comments. Not all the time, but sometimes. They're telling us that we're getting it wrong, and instead of listening to them, we're insisting that we know better than them. I think we can do better. So I did a little experiment, and I want to illustrate my point using an object, because we're good at that kind of thing. This object is a single object. It's not valuable at all. I doubt it was stolen. It's not unique, and it's not particularly significant. If it was the headline in an exhibition, it would not draw in a crowd. But I think it kind of shows the relationship that could be possible between museums and the public. This object, I'm hoping a lot of you recognize or know what it is. Not in a museum context, but I hope that maybe a few of you recognize this from your own personal experiences and your own lives. That's what drew me to this object. It's, like I said, quite a mundane object, but for me, it holds a lot of personal significance. I have a lot of emotions and stories attached to this one object. And in a weird sort of way, I did feel a very strange sort of connection to it, despite it being so mundane. Here is the public object record that anybody can access at any time. As you can see, it's quite bare, it's pretty boring. Confusingly, there's a lot of question marks, which is a bit strange. But I chose it because it's from Malaysia, and that's where I'm from, a tiny little island called Penang, if you guys know it. And I have fond memories of my great-grandmother using this to sweep the porch, and all the great-grandchildren would have to take it in turns to help her use this object to sweep the porch with her. And I don't visit Malaysia very often. It's quite far away and it's expensive to travel to, so objects like this that I still have in my family home in London make me feel closer to her and to my family. So what I did was I took this object, just the picture, and I posted it on Twitter. And all I asked was that if you knew what this object was and you had personal experience about it, that you just like the picture. I didn't ask for anything else. And very quickly, lots of likes started coming in, but also lots of comments. I didn't ask for comments, but they flooded in. The first one from Dictioner, she talks about in here she's talking about her grandmother who gave her one of these brooms when she first moved in with her boyfriend. Dictioner and Rich are in a mixed-race relationship, as am I, and objects like the broom help us feel a bit more closer to our heritage, but also helping to bring outsiders into our own culture. So that was a really nice interaction that I had with her. Again, more comments. Alex talked about him and his sister sharing the chores. Chansey talked about her parents correcting her behavior with the broom. Navjot named it the Jadu, and Stephanie talked about how she was going to share the picture with her mum. We had people coming up with their own hashtags. We had people sharing their own photographs. None of this I asked for. They all gave this up willingly. Lots of personal stories about people's mothers, grandmothers, about the fact that they still use this object, the broom. Again, different names, more people commenting. And we had some really great conversations online about a broom, of all things. And here's what I came up with. After 3 days of having that picture online, I had 4 different names, 5 different uses, 4 generations of people using it. And the most interesting thing for me was 11 different countries. I thought the broom was just an Asian or perhaps African thing, but across all different nations, people felt some sort of connection to a broom, a really basic object. But let's look at the object record again. Like, what a difference one tweet can make. Now, I realize it's not a practical idea to tweet about every single mundane museum object that you have, and we have millions of objects like this, and it's not possible to do that for everything. There are plenty of poor records, we all have them, but these objects have a lot of potential. And I know it would be a mammoth task to collect all of these public stories, but I wanted to show what the possibilities were, and how we can look at our collections from a different perspective, get down from our high horse, and how we can interact with the public and let them in. So what practical things can we do instead? Well, I wanted to share with you this amazing work by a friend and colleague of mine called Ellie Armstrong. Ellie is a member of the front of house team at the Science Museum. Every day she speaks to visitors, she interacts with them on a daily basis. And she was bearing the brunt of a lot of conversations, people outraged about the fact that the museum wasn't representing LGBTQ stories. And so what did Ellie do? She went away and she did her own research without any curatorial help. She spoke to lots of different people, including the public, and she designed her own LGBTQ tour. She used objects that were already existing in the permanent displays in our museum. And now you can sign up and you can take a tour by Ellie, and she does them every weekend in her own time, not affiliated with the museum, and she's not getting paid to do this. Or how about the work of Museum Detox? We are a network of people of colour who work in museums, and we care about the representation of people of colour, not just in our workforce, but in our collections and in the stories that we decide to tell. We run creative interventions to highlight the wider issues of race in museums, and we work towards improving representation. These are all acts of quiet activism, gentle resistance, push back on the old structures that are in place, that are barriers to engaging with our public. The tweet about the broom was just one very small example of what can happen when we stop museum-splaining, when we show a little humility and invite others in. More importantly, the work of Ellie and the things that Museum Detox do shows what can happen when there's a little more trust between the public and museums. And I just want to finish with this image that I saw on Twitter that somebody posted. Some of you might have seen it already. Don't bother reading that description at the end, it's trash. This one, sorry if you wrote that, but this one here for kids, it's not just for kids, it's for everyone. This label, it's fun, it's engaging, they ask a question at the end, it's a joy to read. It's informative, it's accessible. This is what we need more of. Less of the museum-splaining, less of the flexing of our academic knowledge, and just something that everybody can get on board with. And my final thought is, next time when you're at work and you do something, anything that has anything to do with the public, I really want you all just to think about a time in your life when somebody has tried to mansplain or condescendingly explain something to you. And I really want you to think about how that person made you feel and how you wish that they spoke to you differently. And perhaps that's what we could be doing in museums too. Thank you.
Okay, I should have said I'm not going to give you extensive biographies for all the speakers because I'm sure you'd just rather hear them talking than me, but you know, their biographies are in here. Our second panellist is Rosa Anna Di Leila from the Museo della Civiltà. Sorry for all my mangling of pronunciation, in Rome. So should we just bring up your presentation?
Today I'll be talking about a participatory process we carried out during the exhibition, The Making of Point of View, spotlights on the Indonesian and Malaysian collection curated by Loretta Paderni and myself. And the exhibition was held at the Piccolini Museum of Prehistory and Ethnography in Rome, that now is part of the Museo delle Civiltà, Museum of Civilizations, along with other three national museums, the Museum of Oriental Art, the Museum of Art and Popular Traditions, and the Museum of Middle Ages. So, this exhibition was part of the Switch project and presented different points of view and perspective on the Indonesian and Malaysian collections. The aim was to deconstruct the classical exhibition method and ways of displaying ethnographic collection, and to do that we explored many ways of presenting objects collected during the 19th centuries. And we tried to mix the languages of contemporary arts, the autobiographical narrations and methodologies, along with the historical and museographical approach. So the final result was not a linear exhibition, rather four autonomous installations that were the outcomes of the process of collaboration with different institutions, communities, and individuals. visuals. As you can see in this slide shows all the partners that have collaborated in the exhibition for more than 2 years, from the end of 2015 to the opening of the exhibition in February 2018. So we can see the MAXI, the National Museum of Contemporary Art of Rome, Civico Zero, that is a center for unaccompanied minor refugees, H.H. Lim, who was our Switch artist in residence, and two art galleries linked to him. The Embassy of Indonesia that put us in contact with a group of Indonesian students, and the Social Carpentry Calma, who realized the structure of the exhibition. Today I'm going to focus on the collaboration work we carried out with two communities, so the minor refugees of various backgrounds, and Indonesian students involved through the mediation of Civico Zero Center and the Embassy of Indonesia. I'll give you an insight into the participative process, but before doing that, I'd like to show you some crucial points that animated our discussion during the Switch project, and that were for us at the core of our reflection and inspiration. Over there you can see some questions that we asked ourselves before starting the process of collaboration and during the process of collaboration. Our intention was to reflect on the status of the ethnographical objects and collection, and on the meaning of cultural heritage in the contemporary world. Starting from these questions, we decided to create an engagement zones, or rather different engagement zones, each of them tailored on the participant and characterized by a variety of approaches and methodologies. So we consider the ethnographic objects as tools to establish relationship between objects and people. And our aim was to put into questions the assumption that meaning of objects are fixed once and for all, and to create an ethnographic exhibition able to show the constantly evolving process that shapes the social cultural meanings of objects. So we wanted to explore the potential of density of the objects. We decided to play the object collections under different lenses in an attempt to unravel how tangled, stratified, dense they can be, and at the same time to collect new narratives on the objects. To do so, we invited some representatives of the Indonesian communities in Rome to explore with us the Asian collection in the storages. We started with the involvement of 6 young students, Indonesian students in Rome. Some of them were temporary students in Rome, and the others were second generations Indonesian that live permanently in Rome. So Alessia, Anna, Sisma, Evans, Vichana, and Vivaldi, the 6 Indonesian students, visited our storages and selected objects from the Indonesian collection as starting point to recount personal stories and experiences. In this case, the engagement zone was short in time, but very productive in terms of outcomes. All the texts, the interviews, the images, the items for installation were produced by the student both individually and in group during workshop held at museum from May to December 2017. All the material recompose the bond between things and people involved. And our approach was aimed at finding an intimate and personal biography of the collection through the emotional resonance that objects triggered in the visions of our young mediators. But sorry, in the final installation that we decided to entitle Diaspora Objects Reconnection, different visions intersected. The personal interpretation of the young mediators who presented their vision on the object directly to the public by short video. The vision of other members of Indonesian communities involved by the mediator themselves, and the museographic description taken from scientific literature. But some criticism emerged from this process. These different points of view did not always coincide. Rather, they made up a complex framework in which meaning of objects is not already given. So the meaning is constructed starting from the subjectivity of the experiences. So the non-coincidence between personal memories and ethnographical meanings of object could lead to confusion in the final exhibition, or led to a conflict between diaspora view and expert view. So we try to find a balance in two ways. On one hand, we let students free to explore and share their personal memories. On the other hand, we gave them little guidance and more elements for the social and cultural contextualizations. Another engagement zone we created was by the involvement of a group of minor refugees and the collaboration with Maxi Museum and the mediation of Civico Zero Center. We developed an educational project with the aim to integrate the migration center's educational activities and with the museum's ones. So the engagement zone was very long in time and produced a huge amount of materials. We worked on the idea on the transformations, and we found inspiration from an exhibition held at Maxi Museum called Transformers, which allowed us to start a process of engagement and piece together a dialogue between two cultural institutions, a museum of contemporary art and an ethnographic museum. And in a way, we tried to merge the audiences of these two cultural institutions and methodologies of engagement, public engagement. So we organized a program of workshop with minor refugees in collaboration with the Maxi Public Engagement Office. The workshop participants were involved in a range of activities, including guided tour, a storytelling workshop, and photography workshop. So they explored the Indonesian collections while exchanging views with curators, artists, and created shared narration among Maxi Heritage and Pigorini, our museum heritage. In particular, during the photography workshop, through the mediation of the camera, the youngsters redesigned their personal relationship with museum spaces and collection, and create a collective photo map of their viewpoints and their impression on the collections. Then the workshops led to the creation of three-dimensional collages created from the photograph taken during the various workshops. So the teenagers transformed the museum Indonesian and Malaysian collections, breaking them down and recomposing them according to their own perspective. In the final installation, Objects in Transit, Transformation, we presented museum's objects as an educational tool, a mean of socializations and mediation, as well as a starting point for self-expression. Objects moved from one function to another. They were represented, dissected, and regrouped according to a new way of seeing them. So in conclusion, I'd like to share some pros and cons emerged from our practice of collaboration. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Bye. Through the participatory process, we experimented different ways of interact with ethnographic heritage using languages of contemporary art, autobiographical narration, and tools to imagine other destinations for ethnographic objects. The collaborative process allowed us to create a different engagement zone to go beyond an essential notion of heritage through which ethnographic museums have built their own representations and their theoretical paradigms, often giving unique and Eurocentric vision of the represented culture. So I think that we succeeded in offering to the museum public a multivocal exhibition. And the main positive outcome was the recognition that we all have something to say about objects, even if they are not part of our culture and identity heritage. We can observe them, manipulate them, both physically and conceptually. Concerning the critical points, one of the unsolved issues is the representation of the process of collaboration. These issues emerged strongly in the collaboration with minor refugees. We found it difficult to give the public an idea of the complexity of the collaboration with all its ups and downs. So we wanted to tell something about the participative process, but without exploiting the stories of teenagers. So some questions arose concerning how to avoid the risk of giving just a reconciled representation of the collaboration. And we asked ourselves how to design an exhibition that doesn't hide conflicts and friction. I'm not just talking about the conflicts and friction that can emerge between museum staff and people involved, but in general the conflicts and trouble that people involved experiment in the diaspora context. So my question is, how can we show conflicts that emerge in the participative process? Are conflicts interesting for the museum publics? And are publics interested in community engagement process while they are visiting an exhibition? A second criticism is about the continuity of participative practices. The engagement zones we created did not involve the museum as a whole and did not become part of the ongoing museum practice. So the participative practices are occasional and tend to create relationships around a specific and temporary project, with the results that when the project ends, it's difficult to maintain a dialogue with people involved in the community. My last remark is more general. In Italy, diaspora community usually don't demand more involvement and representation to museum. This influences the quality of relationship between museum and diaspora community. This way, it's always the museum that sets rules and shapes the participative zone. And the actors, the participants are just invited. So this, of course, is an issue that we need to resolve in order to build a more balanced relationship. So I'm going to leave you with a final question. How can we build more balanced relationship in an unbalanced context of encounter? Thank you.
Thank you for that, and hopefully we can come back to some of those questions. I might throw some back at you, in fact. So our final panellist is Michael Barrett from the Världskulturmuseum in Stockholm.
If I can find my presentation somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so my presentation will zoom in on one particular experimental project that the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden began in 2017. The project is called Afrika pågår in Sweden, which is very difficultly translated into English as Ongoing Africa. And it takes inspiration from the principles of inclusion, of relationality and co-creativity, which are at the forefront of the Switch program. And the project also stems from new directions that our institution have been taking and that we are pursuing right now in terms of a new mission statement and a new development strategy. And the most important outcome of these processes is for our museums to be relevant to more visitors and to more diverse visitors. So in view of this work, Ongoing Africa specifically addresses our current, I would say, inability to be relevant to people of African descent in Sweden. So the critique of the ethnographic museum and the need to decolonize it has been thoroughly debated, also here in these conferences. So I will not spend much time on that here, but I will ask the simple question: why do people of African descent in Sweden choose not to take part in our shows and events? And based on my own 13 years as a curator for Africa, for the African collections, my hypothesis is that there are three problematic areas in how Africa has been approached in our museums. One is, of course, about representation and how and who talks about Africa. And as an example, we have the old African exhibit that we had in the museum prior to the one that I'm going to talk about today, which was an African village from the Congo. And secondly, of course, it's about the nature of our collections, being heavily from the turn of the 20th century, from the colonial period, and thus a very limited section of African history, you could say. And the third issue is the issue of repatriation and restitution, which I think we will talk about more tomorrow. So the nature of colonial collections. So turning to Ongoing Africa, this is the designer of the physical space that we created in Ongoing Africa, Yinka Ilori, who is a British Nigerian designer based in London. So this is a long-term public engagement with our collections from Africa in collaboration with people of African descent in Sweden. And the purpose is to adopt new strategies and new perspectives on the continent and making our museums more relevant for a broader and more engaged audience. So ongoing refers both to the ever-changing nature, of course, of this heterogeneous continent, this very vast continent, and also to the need to continuously develop our tools and methods to grasp and to make sense and to tell stories about Africa and African achievements through our collections. So it is kind of a hybrid platform that we've created. It's both an exhibition, it's also, like as you see here, a workshop room. It's also a library, and to the left you can also see that it's a kind of a hangout area where you can just be and charge your phone and read a book, or just be in this, to my view, a very beautiful space. But there's also a minor exhibition area in here. Because this project relies heavily on public programming as well, not only this physical space. It also sort of extends outside of the museum. Very, 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 yeah. The target groups of the project are African diaspora in Sweden. Secondly, it's also school groups and schools. But there's also, of course, a great part for the general public to take part in many of our events and outcomes in this project. And the project began, as I said, in 2017, and it will go on for a minimum of 3 years. We have a project group of about 10 people, and we all have a brief to focus on experimentation and to look closely on the methodologies that we used, and also finding ways of evaluating the impact of what we're doing here. And as I said, this project is very much dependent on engagement beyond the exhibition context in itself. So a lot of program events, a lot of educational workshops. We work with residencies, and we work a lot with digital content. So we will invite scholars. We already have invited scholars and artists, activists, and with a very strong emphasis on actors from Africa or from the African diaspora in Sweden. The focus in terms of the object is very much on multidimensional objects, the density of objects that you were talking about before. We're looking very much for objects which are relevant for and may be extended into various forms of action in and outside of the museum. And I'll explain that more carefully in a while. And as I said, we're very much in the beginning of a very long development process. We built the physical environment, and now we're working on creating a library of extension topics and a digital presence. And we're also working very, very hard in developing an audience and a user network, both in Sweden and on the African continent, that will be very much involved in this project. So in view of the problems with our conventional presentations of Africa that I mentioned before, we're emphasizing three main areas of transformation. So those are collections, perspectives, and methodologies. So in terms of the collections, we want to adopt a much broader view of what our collections are about. So that means scouring the collections for previously unnoticed objects and listening very carefully to what our participants and our target groups are asking us to engage with. We're centering some new issues like creolization, resistance, mobility of culture and of people. We focus more on the post-independence situation, and we focus on authorship and agency. And that means also including other public collections than our own. And I think that's a very important point that I want to make. When we turn into the second area of transformation, which is perspectives, because we will focus very strongly on diaspora perspective. So that means we will be looking at the historical presence of in Sweden of people of African descent. So we see here to the left Sarah Makatemele, and to the right Mkwelantaba or Joseph Zulu, who are two people that came in the 1860s and 1870s to Sweden through various means. So we're creating these a number of digital and also physical in the exhibition room biographies of these historical figures. We're also in the process of creating creating a digital database on the archival sources for such histories. And why are we doing this? Well, several reasons. The museum has historically been the foremost producer of images and ideas about Africa and Africans in Swedish public discourse. That means we also have a responsibility to address how racial and cultural stereotypes have been projected into the present. So historical Afro-Swedes are a very important lens through which we can study such processes. And also the focus provides us a background to our own collections, because some of the people that brought objects to our collections also brought people to Sweden. And conversely, some of the Africans that came to Sweden historically were also important collectors of objects in our collections. For instance, Joseph Zulu was part of the ethnographic missionary exhibition in 1907, and he was one of the important people behind that, which is not very well known in Sweden. And thirdly, of course, this is a way of demonstrating and giving background to the Swedish involvement in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, which is not very well publicized in Sweden either, which is sadly lacking in our curriculum for schools and so on. This is a photograph of St. Barthélemy, which was a Swedish island in the Caribbean for almost 100 years. And the city of Gustavia was, of course, built by slave labor during the time of the Swedes. And then it was, of course, sold back to France, but that's another issue. Secondly, we also want to focus a lot on the intangible culture side of collections, which means bridging past and present and engaging with more of the senses. So challenging seeing as a primary mode of interaction, a critique that, for instance, Viv Golding has developed, and choose objects that can connect and activate historical and current immaterial heritage and practice, like those connected to craft, connected to music, dance, religion, or ritual, in the diaspora or on the continent. So an example of that is the sculpture that you see on the right, which is part of the first installation that we did, which is an Erishango sculpture from Nigeria. And through that sculpture, we want to work together with some Orisha dance companies in Stockholm that do storytelling and dance the various Orishas that are very important today. It's growing religion everywhere, I would say, in both Europe and in the Americas. Secondly, like the other example is this shield from Ethiopia, which we found out through working with some of our communities is a very, very strong symbol even today in Ethiopia. So it's in that sense it's a living heritage in that sense. During the parades that are held in Ethiopia in March, which is the commemoration of the Battle of Adwa, 1896, when the Ethiopians defeated the Italians. So this is an object that is immediately recognizable to a lot of Ethiopians and Eritreans. And for that reason, it's one of those objects that we use that have a very dense history and dense usage. So turning to methodologies, when we look at the methodologies and methods and technologies we use to engage audiences, it's important to ask one question, I think, or two questions. Who is an expert, and how is expert knowledge created? And we're trying out various ways to address this. As you hear, we have a lot of sort of mini projects going on and a lot of small projects going on. And this is one of them, where we use popular history or explore popular history as a way of looking at history. And it's a sequential artist called Eric Basir from the US, based in Chicago, who we commissioned to do this short sequential art graphic novel or graphic mini novel about Badan, who was a Swedish, he was born in St. Croix, brought as a slave to the royal court in Sweden, and became a very important person in Stockholm in the 18th century. So this is about him, and it's also about our collections and some important collectors that we have. Anders Sparman, who is, Anyway, I won't go into that in too much detail. We also will be working with Wikipedia workshops, which is where we invite audiences to engage with particular topics that are close to our exhibition, to our collections and to our activities. And we together work in workshop form to improve the quality of Wikipedia. We also work with source criticism for schools. That's an important thing and very, very popular thing for schools to do. So whereby schools can come and actually take part of or facsimiles of our archives to see how history is created and how knowledge is created around our objects. We also work, of course, with artists. This is Christian Nyampeta, who is one of our artists in residence, who is currently making a film about the history of our museum. And finally, but not least, we try to develop this workshop format that we call Encounter the Collection, which are kind of object workshops with communities or loose groups of various origins that encounter our collections. This is Dusit Abdiali, who used to be our intern, worked for 6 months in our museum. And she's leading the workshop here on Ethiopian objects. And that's a very, very important form. I think I mentioned before the shield. The shield that we exhibit now is a direct result of one of these workshops. So it's a matter of finding out more about the objects, of course, but also finding collaborators and building relationships. And you see me there in the right-hand corner, surrendering my authority in a way, sitting back a bit, trying to listen and also then using the feedback and using the input and give credit for that when we've done that. I'm going to round off with some of the challenges that we face with this project. The most important one, of course, is to create relationships, and that's something that we really need to. We're really in the start of doing that, so that's something we have to work more on. One thing is also visibility. This is, as I said, a hybrid project, a hybrid exhibition, and it does not really go down well with the press, for instance. So we had a journalist that came to the museum to look at the exhibition, and then basically asked the questions: what is this, and how should I write about it? So that's the challenge. How do we create visibility around this when the press don't really understand what kind of an exhibition this is? It's not something that's perhaps so common for them to look at. We're also struggling a bit with how to use evaluation, or what types of evaluations we should use, how to create reliable quantitative and qualitative methods to evaluate the impact, and how to connect what we are doing to existing tools like Visitor 360 that we're already using. And finally, a main challenge is also to incorporate these results and the insights that we create through the workshops, for instance, and the feedback that we get from our collaborators, and how also disseminate these methods that we create, these formats, for instance, into the building, into the museum. How do we get people that are not part of the project to get on board with the methods? And how also to make some of the results visible in the permanent collections. So those are some of the challenges that we are working on and that we are going to continue working on this year. So I think that was about it. Thank you for listening. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much for that, Michael. So we now have just under 40 minutes for discussion and questions before finishing for lunch at 12:30. So I'm going to urge you not to save up all your most burning questions till 12:25. Get them flowing now. And yeah, I will hand, if people have questions from the outset, I'll hand straight to you. I'm going to bring you the microphone again so that the stream picks us up.
Well, thank you very much for 3 brilliant presentations. Just a question for you. I think, Rosa, you left us with the questions how to continue working with certain communities. I think for me the question is for all 3 of you, how did you present or represent the results of your community projects in the museum? First in the museum, how did you put the input? For instance, Michael talked about this a shield project, Ethiopian shield project. How did you put the knowledge you gained from the intangible knowledge, how did you bring it back in the museum, in your database, in the exhibition, and later possibly online?
Yeah. Should I start? Or you?
Oh, it's okay. Okay, so yeah, about the collaboration and to give continuity and the creation of a relationship. It's quite difficult to create a unique perspective inside the museum, because not all the curators or other professionals have this kind of perspective, so it's very difficult. But I think that this experiment, our exhibition was an experimental one. So we received a lot of positive feedbacks from our colleagues. It was very interesting because the feedback was on the design of exhibition and in the way we set it in a horizontal way. So I think that we give results to the collaboration, but we have to work a lot in this perspective. So I don't know if I...
Okay, so for us, as I mentioned, we're really in the beginning of this work. The thing we did with the shield, that was the first example, really, where we actually took what we learned from the workshops and put it into the exhibition room. But not so much in the sense of publishing interviews or excerpts of what was said during the workshops, but more in the terms of the selection itself, that this is an important object that has the capacity to start conversations in this particular group among Ethiopians and Eritreans. This is immediately it starts conversations. So in that way, in that kind of simple way, we've used what we learned. The plan is, of course, to do this more systematically. So, of course, updating the database, that's a given, but also using digital media to maybe have interviews with people that express their feelings around these objects. We also want to use, we have an exhibition called The Storage, which is kind of a play on an open storage. With the idea behind that is that you can actually change the showcases very quickly. So we want to use some of those showcases as showcases for various projects, so that we could actually, that could be one way of doing it. But we haven't really realized that yet. That's something we're working on.
I suppose from my perspective, I don't really have much personal sort of experience of that kind of learning being embedded properly into an organisation, hopefully one day. But what I have seen a lot of is that learning being held onto temporarily and then sort of forgotten, or you lose touch with those communities, and the sort of information then learning that you get from those people isn't carried forward into like curatorial practice. I've seen a lot of temporary exhibitions, and then that knowledge just gets forgotten in the end. So I guess it'd be, I don't know, quite interesting to see where your projects go and how you can embed all the learning that you've taken into the future, and how you can help that shape your organisation. Because I think it exists in a lot of individuals, but that doesn't make the organisation. And so yeah, I'd just be quite interested to see how that goes in the future.
Thank you very much. It's very inspiring, the entire day. And I have a sort of a technical question, which is also a question that I have for myself. I really appreciate the long-standing collaboration. You know, the time span is very important to a lot of our projects, because we actually also get to know each other better as collaborators. But I wonder, like, how, in this case of the workshop in particular, how do you select the person, and how can it function within a system that we have that goes with a curriculum that's very standardized? So you have the expertise, zum Beispiel. Then I become German because it's the institution I work for, so it's kind of a click. So you have, you have job interviews, no? And so to have a workshop, you have to have museum experience, for example. So how do we put together this expert knowledge, the knowledge that a person has, which is not in any curriculum, and then how do we integrate it into the structure about how we select people to work with us? Because it doesn't exist until now, you know, and I don't know, in my opinion, it's not enough to be Italian to be, you know, chosen to do that workshop in a museum with a collection from Italy. So it's a technical question, but like a dilemma for us to make this project sustainable in a way, to integrate them.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Sorry.
You're absolutely right. I mean, and I don't have a really good answer for how the selection process could work and how you could merge these two systems. But of course, the people that we use as kind of facilitators, like Dusit, that's on the photograph here, of course, there are people that have some knowledge, some prior knowledge, and that have studied these issues. There might be people that are artists or that are experts in their own right. So, of course, we still have that kind of separation between expert knowledge and other types of knowledge. But I'm not sure that it has to be that of a big problem. If you're just open to people, to invite people to come, and you really try to look widely through society and people that have shown an interest in this kind of cultural heritage, or have an interesting, surprising perspective, maybe. I don't know, but of course, if you're pointing to a dilemma that's definitely very difficult to resolve. The other way that we've been working, apart from facilitators, is we've been working with an art hall or an art gallery, public art gallery, in one of the low-income suburbs of Stockholm that already have a structure of groups. There's one women's cafe and there's one language cafe that meet regularly, and we've also done these workshops there with them. And that's another form of workshop really than this one. So yeah, there are different formats you could actually use, and as I said, we're still experimenting to trying to find what is the best way to work with this, but yeah.
Anyone got anything else to add, or no? Okay. Saw you next.
Well, thank you for the presentations. I have a question for Michael for his choices in terms of geographical inclusion, the relation between Sweden and the rest of the world. Because on the one hand, if I understood correctly, you're privileging the diaspora in Sweden's point of view of possible African or original African points of view, or how does it work? And secondly, what about the fact you mentioned that both the space designer and the comics books author were coming from London and Chicago, and so is it because there is no possibility or no choice available in Sweden itself?
Yeah, those are good questions, of course. What can I say about the diaspora? Well, what I mean with the diaspora, that's one perspective that we want to pursue, that we find that it's very important, but I don't think that will be the only perspective that we're going to pursue. We also want to create collaborations with the African continent, so institutions on the African continent, and more practitioners in the African continent. But we started kind of abruptly with what we had and the networks that we had, so that's why you see that selection of people. Those were people that were already in my network, so to speak. So that's of course problematic, but it's a beginning. You have to start somewhere. That's really how one of the ideas behind this project is: we start and let's see where we go with it. But so it's not really 100% well thought out before. It's something that we want to learn while we're doing it. That's really basically what I'm saying. But those are very good points, and there are definitely people in the African diaspora in Sweden that we will use as artists and and as practitioners as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these wonderful presentations and sort of showing us some of these really kind of very diverse initiatives. And I had two questions. One for Michael about you mentioned them only very briefly, the sort of you being a source for schools that they can come to you and sort of learn, come and see how history is created. And I'm really interested in that, because it's one of the things that we're trying to see whether we could do more of that, especially knowing, having my kids go through the school system and seeing the sources that they get, which is quite problematic. And I'd like to learn from how you guys are doing that. And then the other one, I think, is for Shaz. just the way that you've done your sort of, I don't know if it was an experiment or not, of the Twitter experiment, which really kind of is wonderfully rich in what you could do with it as a museum. Was that an experiment from the museum that you were doing it, or was it a personal experiment? And how have you, if it was personal, how are you translating that into your practice now at the Science Museum?
You start.
Okay.
I've talked a lot.
So yeah, it was from my own personal Twitter account, but my personal Twitter account is affiliated with the Science Museum's account. And how I'm embedding that into my everyday practice. I think, so the interesting thing about the Science Museum, the curatorial team is very white. And up until about 6 months ago, it was all completely white. And thanks to the quick thinking of my line manager, there are now 4 people of colour within the curatorial team, and so I've been noticing personally I can pick up on so many more different things in team meetings and within our collections management database that a lot of the other curators haven't been able to pick up on in the past. And there's a little bit of, from both sides, me finding the confidence and them giving me the space to voice what my opinions are and how I feel about the way we've interpreted collections in the past. And how we can improve them. There are lots of things happening all the time with our collections, and I think it's important to have different voices in the curatorial team being able to make decisions. And I'm very thankful that my museum have given me the space to do that, but also, again, I think it's partly down to me to use what I've learned from what happened on Twitter to find the confidence to speak up a bit more and to say, actually, I think maybe we could try doing it this way instead.
Push you a little bit on that because I think it was really a phenomenal sort of way of seeing how it would be a really great sort of project to see how would you be able to have a multi-perspectivity crowdsourced, and I mean it's not the only project that would have done that, but and then how do you feed that into the database, for example? Is there any way that people in the Science Museum are thinking this is really an exciting possibility, especially being in a science museum where you would hope that their sort of technologies are in the 21st century, so I'm sure they're also kind of thinking in how do we translate our databases to become 21st century tools.
There's a lot of work that the curatorial team do with the comms and digital, so we've just launched our random object generator, and you can like set it as your screensaver or whatever, and it just, every 15 seconds it refreshes with a new picture and a new thing about something in our collections. And we've had so many great responses from people who don't normally interact with our museum because they've seen it online and they're really interested, and it throws up a whole range of crazy stuff that we have in our collection that people wouldn't expect to see, and I think that's sort of one way in which we're sort of trying to have this open dialogue between... Yeah, so people are approaching us and being like, this is really cool, I know about this, I know about that, I want to talk to you about this. So there's we weren't expecting it, but it's launched a few days ago, but we're having so many interesting conversations happening from that. I think we could take that really far.
Yeah, so I'm not really the expert, because this is the educational officers have developed this program over a number of years. So I've not really been involved in that. What I do is kind of provide some of the interesting cases, that letters and things that concern particular objects that would be interesting in these circumstances. But so what they've done is, as far as I know, they've created these boxes it's mostly about colonial history, because that's why a lot of schools come to our museum. It's the only place in Stockholm where they can actually study colonial history and Sweden's involvement in colonial history. So it's finding these interesting people, Swedes usually, and finding those that interacted in various ways, for instance on the African continent, finding the tensions between what is written in the catalogue and what is written in correspondence and what is written in old catalogues and old documents and things like that, just to show how sort of fragile the knowledge that we present sometimes on labels and panels are, because of the different views of different people over time and so on. So I'm not the expert really on how they conduct the workshops, but it's part of what we're doing, and we are feeding in interesting cases into these little boxes that they create and bring forth and use.
And the boxes are taken to the schools, or the schools come to the museum?
They're in the museum, so it's part of like a workshop, a visit of school groups. So they're usually students around 13 to 18, I would say, that kind of age group that are doing this, and it's becoming popular. It's a format that they get a lot of requests to do.
I'm going to take chair's privilege and interject here just to say, Laura, that I would recommend talking to my colleague SJ, if SJ's going to be around later, about some of the critical thinking work that Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology here have been doing with secondary school age pupils, encouraging them to kind of think in those more critical ways around objects. And also to say, I think it's really interesting, these conversations about how do these kind of co-created bodies of knowledge find their way potentially into the object records. It was really reassuring for you to say, of course that will happen. And I think we know quite often it doesn't. And I'm thinking of about 10 years ago in the UK museum sector, the Paul Hamlin Foundation, I think it was, and what we had then, which was the Museums, Libraries, Archives Council, brought out this methodology called Revisiting Collections that was absolutely about making links between kind of co-curation, but then getting it back into the record. And it's interesting to feel we're sort of having these conversations, but almost starting again 10 years on, at a point where actually the technology has moved on in a way that could probably happen in a more smooth, automated way. I'm going to take the comments in the order I saw people's hands, if that's all right.
I think it was Michael who mentioned building of relationships. Relationship must, or in my experience, it should go or must go also towards a personal relationship between museum curators and so-called source communities, and to build up a personal relation takes time. So when we move out, it's months and years sometimes. I think in this project you didn't have that time. You had to present something before Switch ends. Could you tell a little bit about this relationship building?
Well, I didn't prepare this only for Switch. I just have to, for the record. So some of the relationships are continuation, and some of the practices that we're doing are continuation of things we've been doing before, of course. And as I said, it's a minimum 3-year project. So we have actually been promised that this project with this group of people, I mean, in-house, can continue for at least 3 years, which I find is a very important aspect of this. Otherwise, I don't know what it would really mean. But how you build relationships, I should also point out it's not only individual relationships. We also work with some associations. We have, for instance, the Afro-Swedish Association, which is it's a political lobbying group, you could say, in Swedish society, engaged with civil rights and rights issues in Swedish society. They have been a very important partner for us, actually for quite a long time, so they're also part of this project. We have also worked with more sort of ethnically or national-based associations, because that's historically in Sweden a way to get funding, that the Swedish state would give funding to cultural organizations that are, based on national or ethnic, mostly national, but also in some cases ethnic allegiance or whatever. So it's a mix of various relationships, not only personal, but of course in the museum, I mean, museums are good because we do have the opportunity to build personal relationships. They are spaces where you can actually engage, so that is important. I can't really say much more about how we're working. I mean, how did you work on that?
Okay.
I think that's...
Piccolini Museum participated in the REDMI project in the last European project. So we worked a lot in the previous year in collaborating with diaspora associations. And we organized a big collaborative exhibition. So we, at first, we didn't have any relationship with diaspora individuals or organizations. So we had to literally build some. So we invited a lot of organizations. We keep in touch, and then in a sort of naturally, some associations started to wanted to continue this kind of relationship, so we engaged them in that project. In this project, in the Switch project, we worked in another way, because we wanted to work with second generations and refugees, because we wanted to experiment other ways, so set up an educational project, and in a way work with the second generation to mediate our methodologies between museum and the first generation, because we realized that work with the first generation was very tough in Italy, so we tried to open up our space to the second generation. And so it was quite randomly in a way, because we contacted the Embassy of Indonesia, and they tell us that there was an informal group of Indonesian students that are already present in the embassy, so we worked with them, and the collaboration works very well. For the refugees, we try to collaborate through the mediation with the migration center, because it was easier, and you know, the minor refugees are a fleeing community. They are not in Rome for a long time, so it's very difficult to have a continuity, but the collaboration with the organization, the mediation with the operators was quite good, so it doesn't work. So it's I think that we have to keep continuing to find relationship. It's not a fixed work, so we have to find solutions, some solutions for each project. And
Before I have to hand on the microphone or give it back, thank you very much for choosing the broom.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to reiterate the point you made about the revisiting collections. I used to be with Emily. It was really significant because it was actually at the heart of the documentation process. But very interestingly, because of the very thorough way in which Paul Hamlin works, is that they actually commissioned an evaluation of revisiting collections in 2013. So I think that really is revisiting collections working. And it's really fascinating because lots of museums don't seem to know about that. And the question is whether they're really interested in this way of gaining knowledge, and that is really goes to the heart of a lot of what we do. Our museums really interested in a totally new way of documentation.
I think I'm inclined to agree, and it's about being interested holistically, so that the people who are working on the documentation as well as working on the outreach projects find that of interest. It's come to my mind recently because across the University of Cambridge Museums we have a group of people called the Changemakers Advocacy Group, and for many of my colleagues in that group, I think it's sort of news to them that methodology exists, but I think it's something that we might find productive to look at again. And now I will hand over to Mark.
Sorry, hi. Again, just add my thanks to you guys. That was, it's been a fantastic session so far. I wanted to return really to the beginning and to the voice of the museum-splainer. I mean, we know that it matters what is said. We know that it matters how it's said, but thinking also about who's saying it. And it was interesting to see in Rosanna's presentation the way that input from our collaborators and community is very much signed, is very much authored, is very much visible. To what extent does the panel, or indeed anyone else in the room, think it's important to do more to expose the voice of the museum-splainer? You know, I mean, should we be doing more to emphasize authorship? Should we be, signing captions or whatever? To what extent that plays a role in taking all of this forward?
So as we all know, museums are not neutral, and curators, we all have our particular political persuasions or whatever, and thoughts and feelings, and they do come out in the interpretation. And on one hand, yes, it could be a really good idea to take ownership of that and assign those interpretations to particular individuals or groups or whoever, but I also worry at the same time that leaves you very open to very targeted criticism. And for example, I don't know if you guys have seen the Past Is Now exhibition that was at Birmingham about a big decolonial exhibition, and it was co-curated by a group of artists and freelancers from the local community in Birmingham. It wasn't curated by, well, mostly by museum people, and they had very strong opinions, and they spoke about collections in a very different way to museums would normally do, and they wanted their names to be put on the labels, but the curators ended up making an executive decision that they should not have their names on there, and it turned out to be a very good idea, because as soon as the exhibition opened, there were a lot of internet trolls, there were a lot of very nasty people leaving horrible comments, making very horrible assumptions about who curated the project. And if those people's names were put on there, they would have been open to some pretty nasty attacks. So in a way, we kind of do need to be shielded by the museum voice that is kind of all generic. And I've personally come under a lot of fire for being quite open on Twitter, and have had personal attacks against me for that. So in a way, it is kind of nice to be able to shield myself with the museum voice.
Yes, I think that, for example, for our exhibition, I said the exhibition was curated by Loretta Baderni and I, so the authorship was really defined and clearly. So we take responsibility for our choices. At the same time, our purpose was to build a multivocal exhibition. So the difficulty is to balance this two aims. So be an expert, so give the perspective, and at the same time to construct something that can integrate the different perspective and voices. So this is the difficult, but I think that we have to try and experiment again about the co-creation of contents, and so that's our challenge. So.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the session so far. I would like to also add that I'm an artist, I'm not a curator, so when I visit museums, I find out that some of these objects that are on display, the explanations about the objects are disconnected from the perspective of the indigenous groups from where the objects come from. And because I've seen a couple of publications and seen displays on the Bini bronzes, and some of the explanations, I find them very strange because they don't represent the perspective of the creators of these works or the groups where they come from. So I'm wondering, some of these objects, is it not possible for more effort to be made to get a true perspective from their origin so that it can be given in a simplified and direct manner, as opposed to a scholarly perspective which does not always reflect, the reality on the ground. So I wonder, because I saw a publication from the British Museum about the Benin objects, and there are a lot of objects there, you say, use unknown. But the Benin tribe has not been wiped out of the earth. We are there. So if you reach out and say, hey, what's this object about? I'm sure you can get an explanation. So it's like the broom. I mean, you're saying the broom was made from, but this broom is made from, in Nigeria, we make the brooms from palm fronds. So when I saw that description, I'm wondering what's happening. So I think that disconnect can be bridged if we reach back to some of these societies to get explanations.
Does anyone want to respond to that, or does
No,
anyone have any
I can only agree.
Okay, yeah.
We agree. I agree. Yeah, that's well said.
I think there's general concurrence with your point. What time is it? If we have one more burning question, we can probably do that.
3 minutes.
If not. All right. Short answers.
No, I'm just thinking about the responsibility we are taking for the people we are collaborating with. Because a lot of projects can only be made because we have something like Switch. They are founded only for a short time. And it's, for me, the same like the situation of an anthropologist field work, yeah? You are going to the people, you're doing work with them. Normally, they are not very well paid. You are building your career on this, yeah? And then you are leaving the villages. And sometimes, some people, of course, going back, they have long-time relationships. But it's maybe the same what I said yesterday. How can we prepare our institution for long-time relationship with our collaborative colleagues and friends in our own countries?
Yeah, very important question, and I can only. It's a part of the. It's built into anthropology. It's built into what we are doing. This problem. There are certain things you can do. I always insist, for instance, on paying people that collaborate with us well. That's a small thing, of course, but I think it's important to show the respect that this is work, actually. It's not only something people are doing on their spare time while I'm getting paid to do that. So there are little things you can do, but of course they won't address the structural problem that is built into the relationship, in a way.
Okay, well, on that note, I think for me what has been very hopeful and very heartening about the conversations we've been having in this panel have been the recognition that we've got a significant distance to go in terms of working out how to take these things from being interesting projects, interesting pieces of practice, shorter term engagements, exhibitions, happenings, into something more embedded, and that the fact we're asking ourselves these questions means we're not being complacent about that, and that we know we sort of need to do better going forward, and that doing better will be about looking at structures and rather than kind of short-term ways of working. But that makes me hopeful for this area of work and its integrity. I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. I imagine lunch is next door. Is that the case?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to hear your presentation.
Enjoy.